have your attention, please? We're going to go ahead and get started. It's a real privilege for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Chris Fore. Chris was my first Ph.D. student here when I started, my first Native American student when I started here in '91. And despite that, he's done quite well and is very accomplished and has been accomplished for a number of years. But it is a real honor for me to introduce Chris. He's currently the director of the Telebehavioral Health Center for Excellence for IHS. And without further ado, the pride of Healdton, Oklahoma.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back today. It's been a very busy day. I've met some great students and just had some really good conversations. So I'm looking forward to continuing that. Be forewarned, I've got about 3 topics and 3 lectures crammed into 1 hour. So I'm going to go pretty fast. We will have some time after this. There's going to be a reception. So I would love to talk to any of you about some of the things I'm discussing if I go through it too quickly. But these are some things that I think are important and I wanted to share with you all. So I will also share with you, this will be a sort of a non-traditional talk. I pull things from different areas, and you'll see this with my first slide here. Oh, if I can get it to go. It's not going to go now. There we go. We'll do that. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we call T-shaped people. This graphic actually comes from Valve, which is a video game company. I'm a gamer at heart. I'm also a tech geek, which is how I got into the telebehavioral health stuff that we'll talk about. But oftentimes I think that in psychology we sort of get into our area and don't look at other areas and other fields. So I wanted to demonstrate that there are some valuable things out there once you get outside of psychology and encourage you to look outside of psychology for some lessons learned here. So this is when we talk about T-shaped people, this is what we're talking about, someone that's very broad knowledge base here. Whenever I hire someone, and this actually came from the Valve handbook on hiring folks for their video game company, they want someone that has a breadth of knowledge. You want someone that can get along with other people, that's had some life experience, that is beyond this I part here that you can see here. That is your expertise. So you want someone that has deep expertise in one area, but then also has the breadth to go ahead and contribute to other parts of the team. They can move beyond that, just that one area. And let me give you a real world example here. I'm part of a psychology internship in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we had an intern that came in who was amazing at treating trichotillomania. She had written a manual on it. She was probably one of the country's leading experts as a graduate student on treating trichotillomania. That was great, except when she came to the rotation with Indian Health Service, we didn't really have that many patients with trichotillomania, right? What we needed was this, and what she had was this. So what I'm going to talk about today, to keep in the back of your mind, is this idea of being T-shaped, having a broad knowledge base, but then having that expertise. Expertise is what you're picking up here in grad school. I would also encourage you to have that broader knowledge base that you can pick up in school or with real life experiences. The other thing I want you to keep in mind today is mentors and mentorship. When I was putting this together, I looked back sort of on my career and how I got here, and almost every single step, I had a mentor that was there to help me along. So just keep that in mind. And as you move through your career, no matter whether you're at the beginning or the end, you can either use a mentor or be a mentor. My dissertation, one of the things we looked at was non-traditional ways of predicting success for American Indian college students. The only significant effect I got in my whole dissertation of about 50 variables was mentorship. Having a mentor available helped move those Native students along. And speaking of a mentor, here we go. It's a little bit dated here from graduation. I also want to talk about, John, I didn't get a chance to talk to you about if you're still doing what Annette and I call Cheneyisms. These are things that John used to say that Annette and I both remember and still use to this day. So, bow or curtsy to the power. So, John, I hope you're still saying this. This is a very valuable life lesson. So, in most settings, who were you bowing to? Who is the power in most settings? It's secretaries, right? It's not the department heads generally. It's the people who can put your stack on top of the inbox, not bury it underneath or lose it. In medical settings, who would you bow to? Who has the power? Nurses, yes, exactly. This is a very valuable lesson. Not that you do what they say, you acknowledge their power, their existence, and move on because that's going to allow you to do your job easier and better. 180 degrees from crazy is crazy. We say this all the time, that if your patient is doing something that's really crazy and they want to do the exact opposite, they're not going to be any better off. Or if your boss or your employee, again, the same thing applies. And my favorite, the one that I see a lot or use a lot, is the map rarely matches the terrain. Someone's telling me, a patient's telling me what's going on, and then you find out that that's not nearly what's happening when you get a third or fourth source of information. Or within my system, the large federal system I work for, Indian Health Service, they say this is how it is, and then I get there and it's nothing like that. The terrain is totally different. The map is useless. So again, acknowledging my mentor, John, here, and sharing some of his wisdom that he imparted to me during my time here. So again, talking a little bit about my time here, I went to the University of Oklahoma for my undergrad. I came here through the PDSP program. Patricia recruited me to come here. Quite frankly, I was not an outstanding undergraduate student. I was struggling, and so I was really happy that Patricia brought me into the program and connected me with John. While I was here, I think I got amazing training for those students that I've already talked to. We've talked about this a lot. We had lots of opportunities. It was a very diverse program at the time. Allowed me to become that sort of T-shaped clinician. I got experience in working in a prison. That was a rotation while we were here. We had a psychodynamic faculty member here. We did neuropsychology assessments here, social psychology. I even got the opportunity to have a practicum in a urban Indian program up in Miami, Oklahoma. I would leave at 4:30 every Monday morning to drive 2.5 hours and then come back and get back about 10 o'clock on Tuesday night after my practicum. But it was an amazing experience, and all that happened while I was here. I then went on to the Albuquerque VA internship. Again, I spoke to a lot of you students about that. This is an internship that I'm still involved in 20 years later. I'm still on the training committee. It's a consortium of the VA, the Indian Health Service, and the University of New Mexico Hospital. Again, great diverse training there. I was able to work on the reservation. I was able to work in a hospital doing consultation liaison service, which for me was a huge eye-opener. And again, work in the VA as well, doing groups and family work. On the left is my first place I ever worked. This is ACL Hospital, Acoma, Cañasito, Laguna, out on the middle of the reservation. It serves two Pueblo communities and one Navajo community. This is where I sort of grew up as a professional, as a child clinical psychologist within IHS. It was an amazing place, very diverse. I did get the chance to work in communities. Being out in the schools and the Head Start programs, doing home visits, those sort of things, which I think really helped sort of mold me later on as far as being comfortable and going out and working in those settings. The lower right is New Mexico Women's Correctional Facility. I worked there for 8 years part-time. Actually, a couple of years of that was full-time. If you ever get the chance to do correctional work, it's amazing work. What I said earlier is a clinically rich environment. The correctional system in this country is the de facto mental health system. It's the one system that cannot turn patients away. If you have a mental illness and you keep screwing up, this is where you end up, and there's not a lot of care there. So it's an amazing place to get rich clinical experiences. So after doing that for a while, started a family and decided that driving 2.5 hours each day to get to work and back was not really working out. I did some work at the prison and retooled into forensic and had a private practice, and that was okay, but still not super great. I went back to IHS and joined the Albuquerque area, as you can see here. And just as a really quick IHS lesson, there are sort of 3 levels to Indian Health Service. There's the service unit level, the hospital level, where I showed you the ACL. The area level, these are our 12 areas across the country. and then the national office, which is back in Rockville, Maryland. So I became the director of, the behavioral health director of the Albuquerque area. So here, I oversaw mental health services in New Mexico, Colorado, tiny part of Texas, and a tiny part of Utah. So we had about 60,000 patients in the area, about 15 facilities, about 30 programs overall that were under my purview. And I did that for about 7 years. This is where we started with the telebehavioral health services I'll get into in a little bit. But this was also for me a really big shift, and we talked about this earlier today, about shifting from a psychologist to an administrator, and how do you make that shift? How do you go from seeing patients face to face to now setting policy that will impact 60,000 people, or setting a treatment that will impact that many people? How do you make that shift to get to that 10,000 foot level instead of that patient-centered level? It's very challenging. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that was sort of the first time I tried to make that shift. And 2.5 years ago, I started working for our headquarters office. So this is our IHS headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. Fortunately, I don't have to live and work in Rockville, Maryland or DC. I am a full-time teleworker, so I get the great enjoyment of working from home every day of the week. My boss is in DC, and the things I do are scattered across the country. And we'll talk about that here in just a couple of minutes. But it's really, again, been very eye-opening as being at the headquarter level, the amazing things that happen at a national level, getting inquiries from Congress, from the president, having to respond to all sorts of directives and questions. It's been really amazing learning process to figure out what goes on and how political things are at this national level. It is quite overwhelming at times. I love it when I get a email at noon saying they need something by close of business Eastern time, which for me gives me an hour or two to get it done. It is very challenging, but that's what happens at that national level and how high pressured it can be. I put this up here so we can talk a little bit about Indian country, because I think sometimes people don't understand what Indian country is within the U.S. Up on the upper right here, this is Little Dolomite Island. It is off the coast of Alaska, 12 miles from the Russian border. This is a native Alaskan community of 300 people. It's tiny and out in the middle of nowhere, very remote. Get there by boat. You can't even take an airplane. There's no strip there. So it's about a 2-hour boat ride from the coast to get out there, and that's if the weather's good. The Taos Pueblo, if you haven't been there, it's an amazing place, a UNESCO site within the U.S. In northern New Mexico. Obviously, very traditional Pueblo Indian dwelling there. And this, those of you may recognize this, although it's an older picture, the Oklahoma City skyline. More and more of our native population, patients, are living in urban areas. And so how do we get services to those folks? It can be very challenging. So as I'm talking, I want you to think about that, about what Indian country is and about how we serve those folks. Also, while keeping in mind this idea of these T-shaped people and these mentors and how this all interweaves. And I'll do my best to tie it together at the end. Let me see if I can get back here. There we go. So this is a map of the tribes within the U.S. I like to share this for a couple of reasons. One is just to show where the tribes are located in the U.S. Obviously, here in Oklahoma, you are very familiar with the tribes here and how they got here. Trail of Tears, rounded everyone up from the southeast and east and shoved them into Oklahoma. And that was Indian country. And that's what I was familiar with going up from Oklahoma. You can see there aren't many tribes left on the eastern seaboard anymore. Down in the southeast, there are a few because most of us got moved over to here. What I wasn't so familiar with while I was here, but I did become familiar once I moved, is out west what happened. Each tribe, almost every tribe, has their own Trail of Tears story. The Navajo Nation had the long walk where they were shoved off into eastern New Mexico and sat there for years before they were put back on what ended up being about 1/10 of their traditional lands here in the Four Corners area. The Lakota, the Creek, all of them have their stories. But if you look, really the population is skewed towards the west, and that's where a lot of our facilities are. So how do we get health care to those facilities, especially in communities where they may be very small, little Dolomite Island, very remote, not have good infrastructure, or just can't get providers. So this is where we started with the idea for the Telebehavioral Health Center of Excellence. About 10 years ago, University of New Mexico got a grant from the state of New Mexico to start telepsychiatry services. And one of our communities, Mescalero, was one of those sites. I became the director or the behavioral health consultant for the Albuquerque area about this time, and the project was handed to me. And it was so successful that we decided to start expanding it. And that's how we sort of got to where we are today. One of the things I will tell you that has been amazing for our communities, those of you who worked in Indian country, is that provider turnover is a huge issue for us. It is a joke among those who go to IHS and tribal facilities that the provider is going to be there for 2 years because that's their payback on their IHS loan or their IHS scholarship, right? In Mescalero, where we've been doing telebehavioral health for 11 years now, in 11 years we've had 2 psychiatrists. In 11 years. It's been amazing. They've never had that much of continuity. Prior to that, they had not even had a psychiatrist for 2 years, period. So it's been amazing the amount of continuity we've been able to provide them. I want to talk a little bit about my staff because while I started this, the way it works now, I could do nothing without the staff I have here. So I want to quickly acknowledge them. Daniel Cook, he's my coordinator. He makes things happen day in and day out. Lyle Benali is our IT specialist. Dr. Miller and Dr. Chase, very interesting. So Dr. Miller was trained in the VA for evidence-based treatments of PTSD, has now taken those skills and taken them into Native communities, where she's doing a prolonged exposure in CPT with Native teenagers who've been exposed to traumas in their life, all via televideo, by the way. She's located in Albuquerque and sees patients all around the country. Dr. Dwayne Chase is an interesting story. As far as I know, he's the only Native American addiction psychiatrist in the country. He was trained at UNM and they have an addiction psychiatry fellowship. So he provides some great, unique skills for us in Native communities where there's often co-occurring disorders with mental health and substance use. And our teleeducation team. I'll talk about the teleeducation a little bit later on, but Mary, Joan, and Elena are all Native and all have great skills as far as being able to walk people through what they need to get through and make our teleeducation part hum. So these numbers are from the last fiscal year within the federal government here. And these are the types of services that we offer. I've mentioned these already: addiction psychiatry, adult psychiatry, child. PTSD and trauma is our newest one. We are, interestingly enough, doing child therapy now through tele. We were just doing psychiatry, and now sites came back and said they wanted counseling. And so we are actually doing some play therapy through televideo at this point. It's a little challenging. You have to have someone on the other end helping you out, but we have been able to do that. So we currently are in 24 sites around the country in 9 of the 12 IHS areas. So last year we saw over 8,000 patients via televideo and provided over 4,000 hours of service. Here's the types of services we're providing. Prescribing is often the most difficult thing for us, so you see a lot of prescribing, the psychiatry services, and a little bit of counseling. And here's the map I really wanted to show you. This is where we are around the country. This is a little outdated. We have spread a little bit beyond this, but as you can see, we're literally from coast to coast and border to border. This is one of our newer sites, Micmac in Maine. It's a pretty small community way up in the woods if you pulled up on the map. This is Kokomish out in Washington State, close to the coast there. Tono Oto is down south, and they actually share. This is one of the interesting things when they talked about building the wall with Mexico. They would actually have to cross tribal land and divide the community. The community is actually in Mexico and the U.S. And so the tribe was really concerned if that were to happen, that it would literally divide their community and go through some sacred ground. So, fortunately that's not happened at this point, but there are issues that are germane to tribal people, even when you talk about the border. And the same up here, Fort Peck. They share, part of their community goes into Canada. So those are our sites sort of across the country. I will let you know that in Oklahoma, we are standing up some sites for the first time. We're working with Chickasaw Nation on a consultation program. They'll talk about here in a little bit around their autism clinic. and we're talking with some other tribes here about doing some direct services. So Oklahoma does run their own telebehavioral health program through the area office, so we've not done as much in the Oklahoma area as we have in others. But this is where we are currently. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is, although in our system, the IHS, we're really underfunded. We're funded at about 52% of need. All of the funding we get goes towards treatment. We don't have any money set aside for research. I would love to research and to publish. We just don't have that capacity. So we partner with universities and institutions when we can. One of the things, though, that our system does respond to is efficiency and being able to use dollars effectively. So I partnered with a health economist from the University of New Mexico to look at what it costs to deliver care in Indian country via several different means, and one of which was telemedicine. So we published this paper looking at psychiatry visits and how much does it cost for a 30-minute psychiatry visit. So if you want to bring the patient to the psychiatrist and pay for those costs in Indian country, that's going to cost you about $333 for a half an hour session. Oh, and by the way, it's going to cost the patient's time and being away from work, being away from school, and those things. We'll set that aside, but just looking at pure cost to the system, over $300 for a 30-minute session. Now let's say we want to get a little more efficient and let's bring the provider to the patient. This is what a lot of our facilities do if they can find a provider who's willing to travel. So we're going to bring the psychiatrist to Muscalero, 3.5 hour drive each way. Of course, they're going to bill you for that drive or get that money back somehow. That's going to land you at about $170 for a 30-minute session with that psychiatrist. When we look at what Tele has to offer, you can see it goes down quite a bit. We're at $138 for a 30-minute session. And this means the provider's not traveling, the patient is only traveling to their local clinic potentially, certainly not to the site very far away. So this is certainly by far the most efficient means of delivering behavioral health services within our system, given where our patients are located and where our facilities are located. So I just would like to share that to make sure that people are aware that this is something that is efficient for our system. The thing that this doesn't take into account that we just published a paper on is the cost over time. This is something that grows exponentially, and you get more returns the more patients you see. So the first patient you see is actually quite expensive. You've got to set up all the equipment, you've got to get the internet connectivity, all these other things. But the 1,000th patient you see is quite cheap because you've already paid for all that equipment earlier on. So you can really get lots of benefits the more patients you see via tele. So if we look at the system overall in fiscal year 17, you can see that compared to traveling patients to the provider, we saved over $1 million by using tele. If we look at money saved by using tele as opposed to bringing the provider to the patients and having them come to the clinic, we saved $178,000. So, the bottom number is not huge, but given that our system is so underfunded, it's definitely not chump change for us. And all that money that we save, as I said, goes right back into direct patient care. So that's sort of it on the facility side and on the IHS and tribal side. But let's look at it from a different point of view. Let's look at it from our patient side. I think this is something that's often ignored here. We started running the numbers, and last year in FY17, we saved 1.5 million miles of travel for our patients. These are patients who are often lower SES. We know that the Native population skews towards lower SES, one of the most impoverished populations in the country. So travel may be difficult and expensive. If we can save them over 1 million miles of travel, that's pretty incredible. If you look at the travel costs here, again, this doesn't go into the pockets of IHS. This stays in our patients' pockets, saving almost $900,000 in travel costs for our patients. Again, when you're living paycheck to paycheck or not even paycheck to paycheck, that can be a huge benefit there. And the last part here, I think is something that a lot of us don't necessarily think about, but we avoided 24,000 hours of missed work or school. Think about many people in our Native communities. They're working a minimum wage job. They don't get leave. They have to go take their kid to an appointment 7 hours or 3 hours away each way for 30-minute psychiatry appointment and miss work and not get paid and spend money to drive up there. It's not going to happen. Most of these people would go without care, which is what we were seeing. So the fact that we're able to do this and keep them in their home, in their school, in their work is amazing. And really, I think has paid huge dividends for our population here. One of the things I want to pause and talk about here, I don't have a slide on this, but I do want to bring it up. So there used to be a question about whether telebehavioral health works. And if you are not familiar with the literature, let me please inform you, that is settled. Telebehavioral health works. It works well. The literature is quite clear on this point. When I first started doing this, we gave services away. Our hospitals didn't want it, even though they were going without psychiatry services. And I said, look, I'll put a psychiatry in your facility via televideo for nothing. They wouldn't do it. It took 3 years before we finally got enough traction to get it going after we had established in that first site. People were saying it was second-rate care. Our patients, our tribes were concerned that, oh, you're just not going to hire anyone now and just give us this tele thing. We don't want that. All that has changed now. Our tribes love this. Our tribal councils love this. Our patients love this. And the research is quite clear that this is as effective as in-person therapy. And I will point out that there are some instances in which it is more effective than in-person therapy. VA's done research for therapy with Vietnam-era veterans. Telehealth produces better outcome than in-person visits. For youth, for teens, telehealth can produce better outcome than in-person visits. I will give you some anecdotal evidence here. Our psychologist who provides treatment and trauma, in one day, she had 3 women come in and for first appointments and disclosed that they had been sexually assaulted. Every one of them, not knowing each other, said that if you had been in the room with me, I would not have shared this with you. I'm sharing it with you because you are not in the room with me. You're on televideo. That distance can sometimes feel safer for folks, and they are more likely to disclose at times. Those women were more likely to disclose because they were on televideo. The other thing I will tell you that we hear constantly from our patients that I never would have guessed, they love televideo because the provider is 1,000 miles away. They won't run into the provider at the Walmart, at the basketball game, at the gas station. They will never see that provider in their community, and they feel it's a more confidential visit. Those of you who worked in tribal communities, you've probably seen confidentiality violated unknowingly, but still it can cause huge consequences. They love the fact that the providers aren't there in the community. So my last piece of anecdotal evidence that I will give to you that I find very interesting is that our no-show rate for psychiatry across Indian Health Service is about 35%. It's just what it is when we average it out. Our no-show rate for telepsychiatry, 25%. They're coming to the same facility. We don't go into their home for telehealth, at least not yet. So people are much more likely to show up for their telepsychiatry appointment at the same place than they are for their in-person psychiatry appointment. Certainly suggests that there's something going on that people like about it or feel more comfortable with. Again, I would love to have some research, hard research to back that up, but if you have questions about tele, I'll be happy to talk to you about it, but it's quite clear that it works. And what I want to point out here is that it does save our system and our patients a lot of time and money and can be very effective. 90% of the sites that we're in, if we weren't doing this, they would just go without care. The patients would not get care at all. So this is a great way for us to get the care when it's needed, where it's needed. I'm going to shift gears here. What happened is after we've been doing telehealth for about 5 years, providers started coming to us and saying, hey, I need CEUs to maintain my license. I need my continuing education credits, and I can't get it. I'm out in the middle of nowhere. How can I get my CEUs? So we decided we would be a technology center and start setting up online training for folks to try to facilitate our providers keeping their license current. The other commitment that we made is that the training that we put out would be specific for natives. It always will include that cultural component. And so that was our mission, and this is what we have been doing for the past 5 years, and this is where we are as of last year. We provided, as you can see, 118 webinars, gave out over 4,000 hours of free CEs, and by the way, this is all free. I'll have the link if you all want to see any of this. It's open to anyone. We often have folks participating from universities, from the VA, from Department of Defense, as well as our IHS folks, and had over almost 9,000 hours of overall training provided. When we look at what folks say about this, and again, this kind of goes back to this idea, can you really have an engaging, thoughtful discussion and training session over technology? That technology for us, by the way, is Adobe Connect. Well, the responses tend to bear that out that we can potentially. 97% of folks report increased confidence in their clinical abilities after attending this training. 96% said that they will integrate this new knowledge into their practice. For me, this is a huge one. Our system struggles with access to care. And so if we can give a provider in a remote site a new skill, we've increased access to care, right? If they have this new skill, now that patient doesn't have to drive to the city to get that treatment. That provider in that site can provide that treatment because they just learned it through this electronic mechanism. 98% said they were comfortable asking questions. So again, that speaks to that back and forth of the training. And then 90% were satisfied with the technology's ability to support learning. Lower than the others, but still higher than I would have expected. There are always a few glitches here and there, but the platform overall is pretty stable and really allows folks to gain knowledge that they did not have before. I can share this with you all later. Here's our training calendar, what's coming up, and our training archive. Our training archive is quite extensive, over 1,000 hours worth of training on topics wide-ranging, but all related to natives. We have, I think at last count, 50 trainings that were on historical trauma. I'll talk about historical trauma here in a couple of minutes if you're not familiar with it, but there's an amazing wealth of training here on historical trauma. We have lots of specific trainings on suicide, on adolescent and youth. Just a wealth of training. I can share that with you and you can go check it out, and it's all free. One of the things that happened, and this kind of goes back, John, to what we were talking about, that once you get into a system and just start sort of raising your hand saying, I can do that, people just start throwing more things at you. So that's both a blessing and a curse. One of the things that got thrown my way was the IHS Indian Children's Program. These are specific funds set aside to help address childhood developmental issues, so FASD, autism, pervasive developmental disorder, those kinds of things. And so this is our newest program that we stood up about 2 years ago. And the goal is really to help address neurodevelopmental and behavioral health issues in youth, where often our facilities don't have this ability at all. So we're trying to be that conduit to help increase the knowledge and skills of those providers out in the community through this national program. And we do that in a couple of ways. So one is we have a couple of series now. We have a series on fetal alcohol syndrome, a series on alcohol spectrum disorder. We will be starting a series in 4 weeks on substance abuse and the teenage brain. I'm lucky enough to be working with a pediatric neuropsychologist and a pediatric developmental psychiatrist. They're the team that we work with, and they've been able to put this together for us, and it's been amazing. The other thing that I want to point out, and this is here, is real-time consultation. So our providers out in the field struggle with these cases when they come in through the door, and they may not know how to deal with them. We basically have an office hours model where every 2 weeks, the 2 experts I just mentioned, they will take cases from anywhere in the country, and they will staff that case with that provider, give that provider feedback on how to move forward with that case, and provide them just knowledge and skills that the provider had no access to before. They just had no way of gaining that knowledge. And so we are able to put this out there in a way that is open to everyone in the country and to really facilitate the most appropriate treatment for youth and kids who are struggling with pervasive developmental issues, FASD, and those kinds of things. One of the more interesting things that just happened 2 weeks ago is here, the Chickasaw Nation here in Oklahoma. They contacted me about 6 weeks ago saying they were going to stand up an autism clinic where they had a psychologist and a pediatrician that go around to all their clinics and screen kids, which is great, by the way. It's an amazing program. I'm so happy they're doing that. But what they didn't have was those cases that were really challenging, maybe co-occurring disorders, maybe on the borderline. They didn't have a way to address those. So they are now using the Indian Children's Program team to address those. So they did 2 weeks ago, they did their first consultation where the team here in Oklahoma saw the kid, had some questions, weren't sure how to diagnose and what the treatments would be. They contacted the team in Albuquerque and they sorted all that out, got a treatment plan going, a diagnosis going, went back, gave that information to the family, and now that family is being followed up back here in Oklahoma. So it's a pretty cool model. We're still growing it. This is, as I said, is our newest program. But I think there's lots of good things happening here, lots of room to grow here. So that's the Indian Children's Program. So all that sits under the IHS Telebehavioral Health Center of Excellence. You can go to our website and see all of these links. And so, this is something that has grown within the agency. I sort of think of it as my baby. It sort of started as this one little site. Now we're in 24 sites. We're training thousands of people a year, and we're having the Indian Children's Program. And it's been a very fun ride, and we're still growing and expanding. I think we're now up to 26 or 27 sites. Having said that, I want to set that aside and talk a little bit about culture, specifically American Indian and Alaska Native culture. I think that there's some misunderstandings, and I just think it's important to sort of address some of these. So one of the first things I want to say is that there are now 573 tribes in this country. I don't know if you were aware, but 4 tribes just got added about 3 months ago. So that's pretty cool. It also points to a very bizarre issue with Native Americans, American Indian, Alaska Natives in this country. It is the only minority, we're the only minority population that the federal government determines if you're in that population or not. Are you a federally recognized tribe? Then yes, you're American Indian. Are you not? Then no, you're not. You don't get services from IHS. If you're not from a federally recognized tribe, we cannot give you services. It's against the law. So that's really bizarre. Can you imagine if the government was saying, well, you're Hispanic and you're not because we say so? I mean, it's just bizarre. But that is the system we have. Let me give you even a more bizarre example. We had an intern come through our internship. She was great. She was from upstate New York, tribal member, grew up knowing her traditions, traditional dress, participating in ceremonies, traditional food. She was not federally recognized because the government said her tribe was extinct. So can you imagine? Her tribe, how, boy, you talk about demeaning and depersonalizing. No, you're not here, you're extinct. It's crazy. I just want to make sure you all realize how crazy the system is in this country when it comes to Indigenous people. This is what we were talking about earlier, just to show this again, how diverse the tribes are. The other thing I will say, because there are 573 tribes in this country, there is much more within group difference than between group difference. Tribes are so diverse and so different that if you pick any one tribe and compare them to the majority population, the Anglo population, there'll be more difference over here than there is between any one tribe in the mainstream. It's just, the tribes are so diverse, even if they live right next to each other. Give you an example from New Mexico. Traditionally, Pueblos, when there's a death in the family, they treat death very seriously. They take the person, literally lay them out on the kitchen table. They wash the body. They dress the body in traditional garb. They do nothing else. They don't embalm the body. The body is there for 3 days. People come by and pay their respects while the body's laying out on the kitchen table. After the 3rd day, they walk the body to the graveyard, cemetery, and bury the body. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a body after 3 days. Not looking so good. They're starting to bloat up. They have cotton stuffed in their nose and ears to keep the fluids from coming out. It's not mainstream. Not what we're used to with modern embalming processes. That is how they treat their death in Pueblo communities. 30 miles down the road, we have a Navajo community. Traditional Navajo community, someone dies in the house, you never go in that house again. It's considered cursed. You burn it, traditionally. It doesn't happen so much anymore, but you don't go in the house. You do not mention that person's name for a year because you are holding them back on this planet rather than going on to the afterlife because you can't let them go. So you have to, working with someone around grief who's Navajo and traditional is very hard when you can't even mention the person's name. And they're not even supposed to be thinking about the person. So that's two communities that are 30 miles apart. That's the difference between those. So multiply that by 573 and you can see how diverse the Native population is in this country. Cultural competence. I hate the term cultural competence. It is a horrible term. I would encourage you to not use it. I know it's in the literature. I know it's established, but we can maybe change that. Cultural competence implies that there's a certain group of facts that you can learn, and all of a sudden, boom, you're competent in the culture. It also assumes that the culture is static, that it doesn't change, that there are these things you learn and you're good. It is, in my opinion, a very Western, a very colonial concept made to help people feel better about themselves. Oh, I'm culturally competent, I can go and do this thing. That's not the way I see it. And let me give you a quick example here. When I worked on the reservation, this was probably about 8 years in. I'd been there for a while. I felt pretty integrated into the culture. I, quite frankly, in my younger self, probably felt that I was culturally competent. One day, I walked into the office of our substance abuse specialist, a local Native person. She was great, been there forever. And I'm sitting there chatting with her. And for whatever reason that day, she looked down at my feet. I'm from Oklahoma. I was wearing my cowboy boots. Not just my cowboy boots, but my black lizard skin cowboy boots that I loved. They were amazing boots, very fine scales, shiny black. Those of you who've seen them, they're great. And so she looks at my boots. What are you wearing? I'm wearing my cowboy. I thought these great. They're lizard skin cowboy boots. She gets this look on her face and pauses. And she said, I'm from here, right? I said, yeah, I know. You're right up the road. And she said, and we have clans here. Sure, I'm not ignorant. Of course I know about the clans, right? And I'm Lizard Clan, and you're wearing my ancestors on your feet. So after 8 years of being in this community and working, I commit this huge faux pas, which brought home immediately to me that I am not culturally competent in any way, shape, or form. I am ignorant after 8 years. So I tell this story for a couple of things. One, to point out that I don't think there is such a thing as cultural competence. I just think that it's a misnomer, and we have some other terms that we can talk about around that. But two, what do you do when you make a faux pas like that? Because you will. If you work in Native communities or in other communities, it will happen. You apologize profusely. That's what I did. You back out and you apologize. Say, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. And you go and unfortunately sell your black lizard skin boots and never wear them again. What you don't do, and I've seen this with some interns, you don't just keep pushing forward and bashing and trying to convince the other person that you're right. You're in their community. You're on their turf. It's their traditions, it's their culture. You don't try to bring them around to your way, you adapt to them. And I don't see that so much with cultural competence. What I do like, cultural sensitivity, that's pretty good. Cultural safety, if you're not familiar with this term, this comes from New Zealand. The Maori in New Zealand were really upset with the way the healthcare system was treating them. And so they took it upon themselves and engaged, the workforce there they engaged, not psychologists, nurses. They got nurses and started being hired and trained as nurses and came up with this concept of cultural safety. It's a lot what it sounds like. One of the things I really like about these last two, it's about decreasing the power difference. There's always going to be a power difference when you're in a healthcare setting, but both cultural safety and cultural humility really works to minimize that. You really go to where that patient is and ask them what they think is wrong, what is going on with them. It's a lot more listening and a lot less telling, which again is not necessarily our mainstream healthcare system. Same with cultural humility. It is almost taking a one down position and again to decrease that power difference, asking that person to educate you about what's going on, what their beliefs are around their illness and what's going on with them. It can really be very powerful. I'll give you a quick example as I'm trying to watch the time here. When I first started working out on the reservation, I was working at Navajo community, and I went to the schools. I loved seeing the kids in the schools for a multitude of reasons. It was great. One day, the bus driver came up to me, who was a Navajo woman, and said, "They arrested my son, and I think he needs help." So, okay, I guess I better figure out what's going on here. So I said, "Well, come up to the clinic." So she came up to the clinic, and we got to talking. Her 19-year-old son had been arrested at 12:30 at night, running down the only road in the whole community that was paved, naked. A little bit of unusual behavior. 19 years old, I'm thinking, all right, first break here maybe, something like that. So I asked her to tell me what she thought was going on. She launched into this 45-minute story about how her family had gotten crosswise with the family down the road, and by down the road for Navajo people, that's about 10 miles. And that family had witched her son. He had been cursed. They were skinwalkers in that family, and they had cursed her son. And that's why he was acting like this. And she was trying to figure out what she needed to do after he'd been cursed. So we had talked about this. So one thing to note here is that she did come to me, a healthcare provider that she knew from another situation, from another setting. So clearly she was thinking in that way. But when I asked her what she wanted to do, she said, "We're going to go get ceremony. We've got ways to deal with this, and so we're going to go do that." So what did I say? I could have said a lot of things. Had I been more naive and not trained as well as I believe I was here, I would have said something like, "You're being ridiculous. He needs medications. Get him to the psychiatrist right now." What I said was, I hear what you think's going on with your son. Sounds like you've got a plan for treatment that will help him. Why don't you go and do that, and then let me know how it goes. So one of the things I talk to students about when I talk about culture and being culturally sensitive and culturally practicing cultural humility is leaving doors open. I left the door open. So what happened? A week later, she comes back and said, "Ceremony went well. It was really good, but he's still not good. He still has some issues. So what can you do? What can you help with?" So at that point, we set up the appointment with psychiatrists, got on some medications, and he recovered. He wasn't fully recovered, but he got better, and she was very happy. So, that's the kind of things you need to think about, is make sure you're leaving those doors open as a provider, as a faculty member, and being able to take that other person's perspective and honoring that other person's perspective, and realizing that your perspective, you have yours, they have theirs. There's no right or wrong here. It's what can you do to help? We already talked about these things. I got a little bit out of order there. If you're not familiar with the term historical trauma, it's not really a definition. It's talking about it. Historical trauma is it's really the fact that when a trauma is experienced, the repercussions of that trauma can be passed on from generations through generations. This is a boarding school, by the way, a pretty dark part of history for American Indian people, where they rounded up all the kids, sometimes literally out of the parents' arms, and taking them to school where they cut their hair. They were punished for speaking their own language. And so what we see with boarding schools is that parents who experienced boarding school, they lost their traditional ways. They didn't know how to parent traditionally. They didn't know how to prepare food traditionally. And so there's been lots of loss around there, and that's where you get some of these effects of historical trauma. And I'll be honest with you, when I first heard about this, I thought, that's silly, that doesn't work that way. But if you look at the literature actually bears that out. This literature actually comes from the Jewish Holocaust literature. And what they found is that in New York City, children of Jewish parents who had been in concentration camps were experiencing all sorts of difficulties, and they couldn't figure out why until they started looking at this concept of historical trauma, that these traumas can be perpetuated through learning and epigenetics, even though this person didn't experience the trauma of the boarding school, they still may manifest some symptoms of that. It may be low level, maybe high level. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is one of the in the forefront of the research on this area. I'm fortunate enough to be with her in New Mexico and talk to her on a regular basis. She is now piloting through a SAMHSA grant evidence-based treatment for historical trauma. She's got a site in New Mexico and a site in North Dakota. So I'm very hopeful that at some point in the near future we may actually have an evidence-based treatment for historical trauma. The issue for Native people is that many have historical trauma, don't necessarily realize it or have a label for it, and then you start stacking concurrent and new traumas on top of that, and treatment can get very, very complicated. There's a lot to unpack, and so it's very, very challenging doing trauma work for many of our providers and with many of our patients. The other things you should be aware of very quickly, the ACE study. How many of you are familiar with the ACE studies? Oh, good. Good. A little bit more than half. That's amazing. Very good. I was way behind the curve on this thing, and it is amazing. Just very quickly, the ACE studies were done in California. They looked at a very large population. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, by the way. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the upshot is that if you have the more adverse experiences you have, the more healthcare problems you have. This was really sort of earth-shattering for our healthcare system. People didn't really think about these early childhood experiences having impacts later on, and not just impacts psychologically. I think people thought, okay, you might have some depression or anxiety, but you look at this. Alcohol use, drug use, heart attacks, suicide, smoking, and this is an older list. There are more and more that we see of this. So what we now know is that childhood experiences have a huge downstream impact on health, not just mental health, on health in general. Okay, sometimes I tell people this and they get really depressed, like, oh, well, we can't go get a time machine and go fix them from back then. But what you can do is help them be aware of these and then start undoing some of these and improving health that way. So you can kind of work backwards with this and help people get better. But first you got to be aware of it, and making patients aware of it can be very powerful. One of the things to know about this with Native populations, not surprisingly, they experience many more ACEs than other populations. It's the bad news. The good news is, for the number of ACEs that American Indians have, they don't have nearly the symptoms that they should, as predicted by this research. So it's really weird in that Natives are more resilient, seem to be more resilient to these ACEs than other populations. Speaking of resiliency, I want to talk just very briefly about that. So trauma-informed care, if you're not familiar with, is a way of providing care that is not re-traumatizing. If you think about it, our healthcare system can be very traumatizing if you have a trauma history. I would say especially for women, you think about some of the examinations that we ask women to do, perhaps with a not same-gendered provider, can be very traumatic. And so what happens? They just avoid care. They just don't come in. Same thing can happen for men, though. I don't want to say it's women. But healthcare systems overall, one of the very interesting things I had not thought about until someone brought this up, dental exams. For a woman or man who's been sexually assaulted involving the mouth, dental exams can be horrible for them, very traumatizing. And yet our dentists, they're not trained in trauma. They don't know how to treat trauma. So making sure every part of your healthcare system is trauma-informed can go a long ways to helping you have a better system overall and making your patients more comfortable and give better outcomes. Resiliency, we talked about that. There's good literature on resiliency around those who are more tied to traditions, are more resilient, tying youth to traditions. Also tends to increase resiliency, especially around substance use. So there's some resiliency there. And one of the new things I'm starting to hear more and more about is sort of this idea of post-traumatic growth. That you can have a trauma and it can be obviously very challenging and require recovery, but there seems to be a group of people who can take that trauma and build on it and actually end up in a better spot than they were before the trauma. That's sort of what this graph bears out here. So it's something new in the literature. I want to make sure you're aware of it. I think we're going to be seeing more of this within the native literature. So again, make sure, just something to think about and to look into. Last thing I want to say, and I know I'm really short on time here, so I will make this quick. One of the things, I've received great training here. I have no doubt of that. And it's been amazing talking to faculty and students here that I really think confirms that. I think there's still great training going on here. One of the things I will say that was missing was this piece, the administration and management. This is what I do all day, every day. This is what I eat, sleep, and breathe. And it was a challenge to get here. I was not trained in this. And let me also point out that if you are in the field, you will end up here. And this is the thing that sort of bothers me. Think about it. If you're a psychologist and you want to move up, even in academia, what, you're going to be a chair, department head, head of a team. Were you trained on how to do that? Were you trained? My psychology program didn't. Unless you go out and get an MBA, you're probably not going to get that. This is sort of a very small call to action from the program that I think if you could do this, it would set you apart from other programs. Whenever I was more involved in the internship and running a rotation, I stood up an administrative rotation, talking to interns and rotating with me about how do you do a program budget? How do you do policies? How do you do a program review? How do you handle HR issues, conflicts between staff? All those things that are very important, but I wasn't trained in. I think there are lots of opportunities here. This is what I said, you will likely end up here, and your skills don't necessarily translate. Just because you're a really good psychologist does not mean you're going to be a really good boss. Healthcare makes this mistake over and over again. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen they take the best physician in the clinic, patients love him, he gets along with everyone else, he's on time, he's responsible. So what do? Pluck him right from the clinic and put him in as a clinical director. How does that work? Just because you're so good at seeing patients, now you have the skills to manage people, to know a budget, to do program reviews? No, but our systems, healthcare in particular, does this time and time and time again. Just because you're good at A, you must be good at B. That's not the case. So just be aware that skills may not translate. For me personally, the thing I struggle with the most, transitioning to what I would call the 10,000-foot view. How do you go from that single view that I talked about, the patient, the family in front of you, the group in front of you, to this broader view? Now I've even had to go up higher and be thinking about a national level view. How do I impact the 5.5 million natives in this country? What can I do that helps the provider in the field do their job better, helps those patients get better from way up here? It's a challenging problem, and as a psychologist, that is about the exact opposite of my training. And so that was a really big shift, and the interns that I see had trouble managing that. That is probably the biggest shift personally that I struggle with. Other things I want to talk about here that you may, if you get into these positions, you need to be aware of. Budget. How many of you are trained to do a budget? Figure out what costs will be for the next year. How much money are you going to bring in? What's the difference between that going to be? Can you justify that cost? These are the questions that you'll be asked when you're in these kinds of positions. HR stuff, it is a nightmare, especially on the federal side. Hiring, firing, disciplining people. It's, I heard a few chuckles. You must have gone through some of this painfulness here. Program evaluations. How do you tell if your program's working? Is it effective? Do the patients get better? Do the patients like it? I don't know. They will look to you to answer those questions, and you need to have some training on how to deal with that. And policies and procedures. Hey, we need a policy. We want to start doing EMDR in the facility. We need a policy on that. You're behavioral health director, right? You write that up for us. Okay, I guess I'll do that. Joint Commission is coming. They want to see all of your charts. Are they in order? You've done treatment plans with everyone, assessments? Those kinds of things. So this is a challenge to the program here. I hope that you can do some of this. You personally, if you want to do this, what I would say, kind of going back to what we mentioned earlier, do I have it here? Yeah. Find yourself a mentor. That's what I did. I had mentors all along the way. I stood on the shoulders of giants coming up and acknowledged them at every step. And now I'm trying to pay that back to some of the younger staff that I have under me. Having a mentor, being a mentor can be amazing. Other things you can do, look outside of your field like I talked about. Behavioral economics, great field. Management literature, IO psychology stuff a little bit, but even just the overall management literature can be very helpful here. Pay attention to your frustrations. The things that are frustrating you are probably frustrating everyone else, and if you can fix it, people will love you for doing that. And as a psychologist, you're going to have a different skill set than most people in the healthcare system, so you may have ability to do that. The same with gaps as well. Establish your culture. We've been talking a lot about culture. What is your culture? What do you want it to be? Do you want to have an open door policy? Everyone says they want an open door policy. Do you know what that means? It means you're going to be interrupted every 15 minutes because people are going to be coming in. I managed for a while. I was over 15 people. I really worked hard to have an open door policy. I could not write 2 paragraphs without being interrupted, though. So that's the trade-off. So what is your culture? What are your values? We talked about this. Hire T-shaped people, broad, deep in certain areas. But the other thing I put up here that I think is a challenge, hire people smarter than you. That's hard. People get threatened when people are smarter than them. But if you don't do that, here's what happens. You start hiring people someone that's not as smart as you, not as skilled as you, even let's say that. They hire someone not as smart or skilled as them. They hire someone. Next thing you know, your program stinks because you've been hiring people that are worse and worse and worse and worse. Fortunately, the reverse of that is true. Here you are, hire someone better, and you can make a great program. It is challenging, though. It's a threat to your ego, right? You hire someone that is now doing the job better than you are. Some people have a struggle with that. But I think that is the way you improve. And then, as I said, find a mentor. I know I'm out of time. I know I ran through a lot. I'll be happy to talk to any of you about this later on or right now. Thank you for letting me come and speak to you. I really appreciate the opportunity and to share this information with you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Chris, Canada has similar culture as us, similar history, but their health service is way different. Is there anything that you see them doing for the